Good evening, everyone. This is Sheila, and this is Roger.
Hi there, everybody.
And thank you for joining us this evening to talk about how we might leverage on storytelling to really support children in their creative writing. This is a topic that's quite dear to my heart. Because I realize how easy it is for the creativity to get squeezed out of children. And writing is something that you must feel creative to do. You must have that creative urge. So I think this method that I've talked to quite a number of people and many teachers, seems to help that. It seems to make that creative spark come alive again. And of course, anything with storytelling in it has to be good, right?
Absolutely.
Before I get into the nitty-gritty, I'd just like to go through why I think it's a good idea to use storytelling to lead into writing. And first of all, it's this. It makes it so much easier. Writing seems to be the only thing that we expect children to come up with compositions, their ideas right from the beginning. When a child is playing a musical instrument, they learn on other people's pieces. And that makes absolute sense to me. You have to learn the techniques. And I think sometimes adults, we forget how difficult things are as children. We're asking them to not only come with lots of ideas, but to shape these ideas and write them down.
Exactly. So, that, I mean, if adults can have writer's block, you can imagine really for children to, one, have to make up a story and at the same time write it down is extremely challenging. And I think, if I understand you rightly, what you're suggesting is that we get the, if you like, the story making out of the way, or we start that process before we actually put pen to paper. Yes,
so you get the children work on a known story, a story that they've been told. It could be a story they've been read. And that really helps, because as well as getting the creative bit out of the way, although that kind of allows more creativity by having those basic building blocks there. But the other thing is that I think we forget that we only get ideas by receiving ideas. And the children who hear a lot of stories, who work on a lot of stories, will pick up naturally the story motifs, the building blocks of story that they can use in multiple stories. I'm sure you as a storyteller have found how much more easy it is, you know, to create stories because you know so many stories.
Exactly. If you have that vocabulary, you have an idea of story structures, and you know, okay, I'm writing a Romeo and Juliet story, or this is a Cinderella story, for example, makes it much easier to know what kind of path you want to follow.
Yes, and it gives a kind of intuitive grasp of story structure. The other very good reason is that if you use storytelling, it makes kids want to write. It makes it fun. And it also models the language that they need to internalize in order to use it in their writing. And that's the thing we don't give enough credit. The fact that children have to know the words, they have to know the vocabulary, they have to know the sentence structures before they can actually go into writing.
I was going to say, because when you've told the story, particularly if it's a traditional story, for example, there will have been repetition, so that will have helped them with the vocabulary, but it will also have introduced the idea that it's okay to repeat in a story, and that can have its own special effect and create perhaps, you know, a more musical element to the story.
Yeah, exactly. And then to go on, if you're looking at it in a classroom setting, you have, particularly in the primary school, you have multiple abilities. multiple language abilities in kids. So if you are using this model that I'm going to teach you, the weaker students can benefit from the stronger students, because they will be able to retell in richer language because of their language skills. And the weaker students will learn from that. They will hear and they will copy. I always think copying gets a very bad rep, but copying is actually a very good learning tool. It's not to be sniffed at. And also, when you are telling a story to a child or you're reading it, you are going above their language level and they can absorb it. It's much easier for them to absorb it, particularly in storytelling, which is so multisensory. They can see your face, see your gestures, hear your tone of voice. The understanding of language is so much easier. That's why storytelling is used so widely for teaching foreign languages.
And again, when you say weaker students, I'm assuming that, for example, some students may be weaker on the writing, but might be very good on the oral aspects of language, or of telling the story. And you may well find that there would be, if they were working in pairs, for example, that one child who was almost dictating the story while the other one who was writing it down. So again, you can get kids to play to their strengths rather than being labeled weak or strong.
Absolutely. I think I better take that out of the my point next time, because now I'm looking at it. I shouldn't have said that, should I? But I also
we'll edit post-production.
Post-production, we'll stay in. We need to be there, warts and all. But I think also what this method does, it creates a collaborative classroom, and there's also so many opportunities for social interaction, negotiation, all those social skills which are so important. So,
and surely the whole idea of why are we learning to write anyway? I mean, isn't that part of a social interaction? You want to be able to share a message. You want to be able to communicate with somebody, leave them an instruction or whatever. And so involving communication at the heart of what this whole exercise, I think, is very sensible.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. I think it's for teachers using it in the classroom. It's a fine, when you use storytelling, and I tell teachers, you only have to be barely competent in order to be a good storyteller in class, because the kids are so hungry for stories. But teachers can fine-tune the language level to the abilities of their students. So it's hard sometimes to find a written text that is exactly the right level for your class. But when you tell a story, you're telling it in your own words, and it's much easier to pitch it.
Yes. And when you say fine-tuning, not even both in terms of the difficulty, but also perhaps if this week you wanted to work on prepositions, for example, or you wanted to work on particular kind of adjectives or feelings in the way that you're telling the story, that's what you would focus on. So again, when the children came to retell it, that would be a natural emphasis that they would probably begin to pick up on.
Yes. That's why I always tell people, before you tell a story, I mean, it's a maxim for the business world. When you tell a business story, you must know your purpose. But when you're using story in the classroom as well, you must think, what is my main purpose for this story this time? And then that will tend to flow better through your telling.
Yeah.
So the other thing for a classroom teacher is a huge advantage to working first on a known story, telling that story to everybody, because then you can do activities that really drill down into what you want to teach in the writing from that story. If every child in the classroom is making up their own story, it's very hard to create activities that will work for all of them. In the same meaningful way that you can do when you use this method.
And I suppose because, again, all the children are working in their own way, but on the same story, that those children who do work quicker can be given more activities to do. I mean, you've got other things as well that they could go on to. And those who take a while to get started or to complete would do fewer, right?
Yes, yes, exactly. And really going back to this is about collaboration, because I'm talking about sharing a story at the beginning and then doing all sorts of activities. And those activities are collaborative. And the children will pick up so many ideas from each other. It becomes a kind of creativity hothouse. I always find that I generate ideas far better in a group than I do on my own. And there are those kids who are loners, just as adults who need quiet, but many kids, you know, will bounce off others' ideas.
Yep, I don't argue with that.
Okay, I was just waiting, Roger.
No, that's absolutely so.
I tend to move on before you start to speak.
No, but isn't that what we're doing also? Why we thought it was better that we make this a conversation for you rather than you be there presenting,
yes,
like, you know, as the voice of a goddess, as it were.
Oh, thank you, Roger. Okay, so the other thing, I mean, it's so holistic, because if you combine storytelling with writing, you're really integrating all the language skills, the speaking, the writing, the listening, the reading. And it puts the learning into a context. It gives meaning. And I think a lot of the things that we do in schools, I'm not saying every school or every school system, but there is a lot of things that don't seem to have very much meaning for the kids. But you find when you use storytelling at the heart of the curriculum, that the kids really get it and the meaning is there.
I think probably one of the key ones, if I was going to use the diagram, I would put listening, actually, because right there, that's the very first thing, isn't it? Because you're telling them the story. And I'm sad to say, I think kids, by and large, are not good listeners or have become less attentive.
Yes.
They're so used to, because of digital connection, that a story really gets them to practice the skill of listening. And then, of course, once they get into working with their partners or partner, whatever, again, listening is at the heart of it, isn't it?
And yes, you're right. It's absolutely vital, and it's something we are losing. I'm hearing that from teachers, right down from preschool right through, that listening is not as good as it used to be. So it's something we need to tackle. And then we get on to vocabulary. I have to say that a lot of my ideas in this area come from a wonderful book called Writing as a Second Language by Donald Davis. Donald Davis is a very famous American storyteller. He specializes in personal stories. But he wrote this wonderful book, which some of the stuff that I'm talking about today is kind of based on, although it's also thinking about it is also based on my previous life as a writing teacher as well, and kind of the whole language movement that I was very much into then. But this particular chart, I lifted out of the book, adapted a little bit, because I think it's such a useful thing to think about. If you think about your vocabulary, a human being's vocabulary, and you think of it kind of like a funnel, like it is in this chart, and the direction that the vocabulary, the words go in, are at the top. And at the top, so you think of your vocabulary not as one kind of big bucket, but as kind of a bucket with kind of 4 separate compartments. And the biggest compartment is the listening, observing vocabulary, the words that you can understand when you hear them and you watch people what they are doing when they say it. That's going to be your largest. There are many words that we can understand in context when people are speaking them that we might not really understand elsewhere. But reading is a little bit further down, and that's slightly smaller. So you don't find that kids generally would read words that are not in their listening, observing vocabulary. They would read them, they would be able to sound them out, but they wouldn't really understand them. So you have to know the words, they have to be used around you before you can read them effectively, properly. Now, a lot of the words that you read, I'm sure you've read books. I mean, I know I've read some storytelling sort of academic tomes, which I've had to have a dictionary next to me in order to understand. And I'm never going to speak those words.
Even the word tome is not a word that I would use, quite honestly, very often.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sometimes surprised at what comes out of your mouth. The more you read, the more surprising words come out of your mouth. But yes, it's not a word that I would use normally in everyday speech. You notice that writing, then you can read it, so, you know, writing comes right at the bottom of that. So in order for words to be in our vocabulary for writing, we have had to listen to them, watch people, you know, see what they're doing. We probably had to read them. We probably spoke them out before they go into our writing. The writing vocabulary is our narrowest. And that is kind of worrying, because we want children to write with a full vocabulary, because that gives you the tools for wonderful description, interesting dialogue. So the reason I'm spending time on this, because storytelling absolutely addresses this. If you are using stories, you're telling stories, you are doing a verbal work as well as written work, the vocabulary grows. The kids are listening, they're observing, they're reading the words, they're rereading the words or retelling the stories, so they're speaking. And all that vocabulary is much more likely to come down into their writing.
Can I ask a question here, Sheila? Because there's obviously a difference from the way that we tell a story, speak a story, and the way that we write a story. As you know, at the moment, we put a call out for stories for the next feast book, a little plug here, on the theme of royalty. And we're deliberately not looking for literary versions of the story. So how do you kind of reconcile this with what you're trying to develop the kids' writing, and yet they're working from an oral starting point?
Yes. Well, it is going back again to their vocabulary. You can't expect them to use words effectively that are not in their spoken vocabulary.
Sure.
So it's what is appropriate, developmentally appropriate. So you are not going to expect, you know, young preschooler or primary kids to come up with very sophisticated writing, unless they are avid readers, unless their parents have a very wide vocabulary and speak to them with a very wide vocabulary. But this is a starting point. I'm not saying this is the be all and ending of writing. It's a starting point from which then you can go on from. And yes, the language might be very oral at the first, but that comes in the later revisions. You can look at that, you know, and you may even bring it down to a sentence point of view. How can we change this sentence? How can we make it more interesting? What other words can we use? But if they've got the story out first and it's kind of there in structure and it's more or less there, then you can start to fine tune and polish up little bits of it. And that's where, and I think sometimes we bite off more than we can chew.
Absolutely.
it's better to let them have the experience. You want them to be able to have written a whole story, because that's, wow, I'm an author, I can write.
Yeah.
Then you zoom in on little bits, and you do the learning of the technical stuff and the more creative use of words on a smaller scale. Yeah.
So you might say, in a way, that having heard the story, I then retell it in my own words, and it's probably still a very oral story. And then we do go through a rewriting process, and depending on the age of the children, how elaborate that might be, during which you might target certain sections and really start moving their written story towards a more literary style. So, for example, when I'm telling a story, I usually just use he said, she said, he said, she said. I very rarely use the kind of descriptive words that we would on the page, because I'm relying on my voice when I'm telling the story to do the growling, the groaning, the commanding, the whispering, all that kind of thing. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Absolutely.
Great. Great.
Okay, let's move on then. I just wanted to talk a little bit, before we get into the nitty-gritty, about how storytelling kind of might work in a classroom. So it really has to start with the teacher telling stories. Now, if you're not comfortable yet with telling stories, get yourself to a storytelling workshop. But you can read aloud. That is allowed, and we do approve of reading aloud. But just do whatever you can. So you tell a story, you read a story to the kids. They listen. And then they start to create their own stories from that. Then they write them down, and then they read them, and they tell them. Now, this at the beginning would start off with stories that you've absolutely told, and then they're just copying and changing the language a bit. But if this becomes entrenched in the classroom, children get their own ideas. This gives them the boost to kind of think up, and they can make up their own stories. I work with a childcare chain here in Singapore, where I kind of help them revamp their literature. Now, they're a very literature-based curriculum, but they have a writing program right from the nursery, which is the 4-year-olds, the 5-year-olds, and the 6-year-olds. They have a writing program, and they learn creative writing. But I help them revamp that so that it's much, much simpler. And particularly for the K2 children, what they do is, in the first half of the year, they're following this model where the teacher tells a story or reads a story, and then they, after doing activities on it, they will write that same story very simply in their own words.
We've got a question here from Mindy, Sheila. She's asking, what kind of length of stories? So you were talking there about the K2s. What kind of length of a story, or perhaps you have an example of a story, I mean, not to tell us, but what kind of story would you tell for
very young ones? I would do very simple patterned stories. So things, something like Bear Hunt. I'm using that as an example because that's one a lot of people, we're going on a bear hunt, we're going to catch a big one. So I've introduced a lot of very simple pattern stories, but something like the story of Stone Soup. If anybody wants to know what that is, I can write some references in my in the email you get. Simple pattern stories, so very repetitive for the younger ones. Yeah, because that makes it so much easier than if it's the story I'm using an example today. I would pitch much higher up the level, sort of upper primary. But I thought you're adults, so I don't want to. I wanted to do something a little bit with a more sophistication to it.
I've used the Gunny Wolf story with lower primary, so that's ages like 7, 8, possibly 9 here in Singapore.
Gunny Wolf is very repetitive American kind of almost like Little Red Riding Hood story, but
Yes.
yeah, those sort of stories work very, very well with the younger.
And a story that probably takes me about somewhere between 6 to 8 minutes to tell, that kind of length.
Yes, yes, yes. Roughly about that. I think you experiment and see. It also you have to see how much time you've got for all the activities and things like that. So how do you establish the successful use of storytelling in the curriculum? And it really is modeling. Everything comes from the teacher. The teacher has to tell. Start with reading aloud. And you have to put process before product. You are not going to get the shiny, wonderful product every time. At the end, the products you will get will be better, but it's a slow process. And the process is about learning. And much more learning comes in actually the process rather than getting the end product out. And really, you've got to create the environment where the children want to try. My husband used to work for IKEA, and their motto is "Dare to Fail," which I think is very, very empowering, because you learn far more from your failures than you do from your successes.
And I'm sure for any kid who's actually managed to write down a story that they've heard in class, I mean, that's something that they can bring home. And of course, the parent's not going to know how much has been left out from that story. All they're going to have is there's a beginning, and there's a, however short the middle is, and there's an end. And I would think there's a lot of satisfaction for a child to be able to say, look, Mummy, this is a story that I wrote in class today.
Yes. Okay, so now let's get down to the process. Going from telling to writing. I know you will be saying, yeah, hallelujah. We're getting on with it now. So how do we do it? First of all, the teacher tells. Then the students really explore the story. This is very important. Then, after they've explored it thoroughly, then they retell orally the story. Only then do they start to write it down. And after that first writing, they can retell the story. And I would also say reread the story. So when you're there reading to a partner, the partner will tell them straight away if they don't understand. They will tell them through, their look. I think we don't allow students often to get enough feedback. And doing this kind of collaborative learning really helps that. Now, after the students have retold, reread, then they revise. And then they publish. And when they publish, then they can also go on to retell the story. So you can work along this thing. So it's not just about writing, it's also about the students learning to tell stories, which is a wonderful public speaking tool for them. And the last one is they can innovate on the story. I'm not really talking very much about that today but I will put it in the handouts. And that's particularly for those students who are doing, find it quite easy. They can twist and fracture and change the story to really make it much more their own. Yeah, what were you wanting to say, Roger?
Okay, I have two questions, and really the first one then just following on from Mindy's first one about how long. Can you put it? What would be? You've got here like 7 steps. I know you can't pin it down and say this is how many hours, but what sort of time would you be thinking that this might take if you were going to go through the whole process?
Well, just telling the story is fast. 5 minutes. That's
the easy part. Yeah,
that's the easy bit. It would depend really how many explorations you would do. And what I would say is there would be some explorations like the bit to get them to internalize the story that you probably do with everyone. But then there will be other things like maybe in this particular, term, you want to go more into the setting. So you do more explorations on the setting. Another time you might be going more into character or into something else. So it would really be, but I think you need to do enough so that they have thoroughly internalized the story.
Mm.
And then the retelling, the revising, well, the retelling doesn't take very long. The revising, may do. It's the writing parts that take the longest time. And I think teachers know very well how long that takes. But adding the storytelling to it is actually not that, it doesn't take that long. I mean, it obviously takes some time.
Yeah. So, I mean, this could be anywhere between, probably at least 3 sessions and possibly as many as 6.
4 sessions. And it would depend on the complexity of the story as well.
Yeah.
So
and the age of the kids and how enthused they get about it. Again, I think as you know, when you tell a story, some stories people really go, wow, I love that story. And others just, don't touch them at all. So again, I don't think that as a teacher, you should expect that every story will necessarily excite the class or provoke the kind of response in the same way.
Yes, you don't want to flog a story to death. Well, you have to see, how the students are responding to it. And if it's so, then you just, you move on a bit faster and find another story. It's really about experimenting. Yeah.
And daring to fail.
Sorry.
I see Anna has read my mind and wants to know more about when you say exploring. So how do you explore the story? I think you've started to allude to that already, talking about setting.
I'm going to dive into that now. It's literally my next slide.
So be patient.
So first of all, you tell the story, obviously. Then you need to process and internalize that story. And it's really about getting intimate with the story. Yeah, it sounds quite saucy, right? I don't mean it in that way, but making it so familiar, like a member of the family. So one of the things that you can do to explore and to really, is imagery work, activating the children's senses, because when they're listening to the story, they've been in their mind's eye, they've been seeing things in their imagination, and you can go back to that. And that is such a deep well for ideas for the story, for description, if you go into your imagination, there's so much in there that you can pull out into the story. We don't often talk about the real imagination work that is needed in writing. We just expect children to have it, but this kind of brings this to the fore. So it's things like very simple visualizations. Their first responses to the story, which you might discover meanings, and that could be just something very simple, like asking questions. And I've in my handout, I've given a whole load of questions, not questions you know the answer to, but wondering type questions, where you may uncover meanings of the story. So what the story, means to the different children. Then you also have to internalize the plot. So what happens first? What happens after that? What happens next? What happens in the end? And you need to build the children's confidence that they actually know the plot. And there's various activities that you can do to help that.
And I suspect we're coming to those in a bit.
Yes, we are.
And just forestalling some questions there.
In the handout, I've given you a whole lot. This is only an hour and a half webinar, and there's so much. There's so much I can't put in here. So you'll see it in the handout. And if you don't understand anything in the handout, you can write to me and I'll explain, and we can get on Zoom and we can chat it through. That's not a problem. So once you've done the basic one, going into the imagination, thinking about the story more thoughtfully, really knowing the plot, the sequence of the story, then you get into the deeper work, looking on different characters, looking at the setting in a deeper fashion. Then you get to writing the story, then telling, revising, publishing. Okay? So we're almost getting to the juicy bit now. So any more questions? You want to
yes, we have a couple of questions here. And one was about the idea of using this process in if you're working with a second language or foreign language learning. Hermione was asking that question because there would be a more limited vocabulary because if they were working perhaps.
So I would, for that, I would use, if it's a second language, I would use very simple stories. So Hermione, think of Bango o Bangau. Okay, that's one of the stories that I use in this. It's a Malay song. It's a story song. We should get Hermione up to sing it, but I don't think I should shame that. But very simple things, a very simple pattern, so like bear hunt, these type of things, where the language is repeated. So actually, the children just have to repeat things. For language learning, that is very, and maybe for language learning, the writing, I would put the writing secondary. I would not emphasize so much of the writing unless they were up for it. They were at their level, they could do it. Does that make sense, Hermione?
There was a question from Deepti who's looking to try this at home. And she says, would you suggest repeating the stories? Though you may have just answered that in the affirmative. Yes,
I would. If you're doing it at home, particularly, you've got the luxury of time. So I would tell the stories a few times, but not so long your child really gets fed up with it. Tell it in different ways. There's an activity which I've got on the handout. I won't be showing you it here. It's called Story Cloth, and that's a great way to do the story. I've given you the handout, and I've given you a video link that you could go to and look at that. So that might be a good one. You know, making a little puppet play with your kids, any way that you can do it orally, so that it becomes, and then you write a book. You write a book with your child, and you just break the story down into scenes. And I would say, if you're doing it with your child, you do it together. You know, maybe you can do some of the scenes. They can do some of the scenes, or you know, you can art and just the child, just depending on the age of the child.
So you could ask the child to give you suggestions about as the Little Red Riding Hood is going through the forest. What do you think she heard? What did she see? That kind of thing. So they're actually supplying the details, the child. So you're actually maybe structuring the story, but your child is supplying those details. Then she smelt something that wasn't very pleasant. What was that? You know, oh, right. And then
for a minute, I thought that there was something smelling wrong at your end, Roger.
No. Let's keep in the world of fiction, please.
Oh dear. So, any more questions?
No, I think we're going through this. Okay, let's carry on.
Okay. So I'm going to take my Ninja paper cow, because now I'm going to tell you a story.
Oh, we should have got a sponsor. We should have had an ad. It could kind of run across the bottom here. Okay.
Here's wonderful stuff for the throat. My voice is not the best, but okay, everybody, sit back and enjoy this story. This is one of my favorite stories. It comes from Vietnam. There were once two brothers. They were sons of a wealthy farmer. They looked so alike. Their eyes were the same. Their noses were the same. They both had the same size feet, and one was just as tall as the other. But their characters were different. At rice planting time, Cham, the youngest brother, he was always helping in the fields. His elder brother, Zhu, well, he would usually find a way to sneak off and sleep in the shade. When the Mid-Autumn Festival came around, Zoo always wanted the biggest and best lantern, and he always ate the most mooncakes. Now, time went on. The brothers grew up. Their father died, and the farm was divided between them. Zoo, being the elder brother, he got the farmhouse, the rice fields, and all of the water buffalo. Chum, the youngest, he got a house, a small house, right at the edge of the farm. He moved his things into the house, and it was a very small house. But as he stood in the doorway and looked out into the courtyard, he smiled, for in the center of the courtyard was a starfruit tree. Twice each year, that tree would bear starfruit. I know. I will take those starfruit to market and sell them. I will save the money in that old pickle jar. I will save until I can buy some hens. I will save until I can buy a field. I will save until I can get married. Now, Cham had to work in his brother's fields for his daily rice, but every evening, after sweating in the hot sun, the first thing he did when he got home was to go to the well and draw a bucket of water and pour it over the roots of the starfruit tree. He took such care of that tree. He fed it with buffalo dung. He picked the hungry insects off it and he pruned it very carefully. In time, small pink flowers appeared on the tree. And then the blossoms fell, and in their place were fruit. Chum waited, and the fruits grew larger and larger. He waited for exactly the right time to pick them and take them to market. And then one evening as he came home, he looked at them and thought, tomorrow I will pick the fruit and take it to market. The next morning, he came out of the house, ready to pick the fruit. But he was shocked, because as he looked up in the tree, he saw this enormous bird. He had never seen a bird so big. It was huge, and it was sitting in his starfruit tree and eating the fruit. And because it was such a big bird, it didn't eat just one or two. It was eating many, many of the fruit. Chum didn't know what to do. He thought of throwing a stone at the bird, but he was a peace-loving man, and he decided to speak to it. Honored bird, you are welcome to share my fruit, but please, could you leave some for me? You see, I'm planning to take them to the market to sell. I'm trying to save. I'm trying to save to buy some hens, to buy a field, to get married. The bird looked down at Chum. It looked deep into his eyes. It seemed to see right inside him. And then it said, I will eat no more of your fruit, and I will pay for what I have eaten. Make a small sack, just the size of your hand, and wait for me here tomorrow at daybreak. With that, the bird flew off. Well, Chum spent that evening carefully sewing a small sack and measuring it carefully to make sure it was just the size of his hand. The next morning, he was standing under the starfruit tree even before the sun came up. With the first brightness of dawn, he saw the bird coming. The bird flew down and landed beside him. Climb on my back, Chum, it said. Chum was frightened, but somehow he trusted this bird. And he climbed onto the bird's back, held on tight to its neck feathers, and buried its head in its neck. The bird opened its wings and rose in the air. Higher and higher and higher it flew. At first, Chum kept his head firmly buried. He didn't want to look, he was so frightened. But after a while, he opened his eyes and he peeked out. And he saw the land so far below and the clouds so near, and his eyes grew wide. They flew for what seemed like many hours, first over the land and then over sea. And then at last, the bird dove down, 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 down to a small green island. They landed in a valley. The slopes of the valley were covered in trees, and its floor was covered in beautiful flowers of red and blue and green. "Fill your sack, Chum," said the bird. "Fill my sack? With what?" And then Chum looked down, and he saw what he had taken to be flowers were not flowers at all, but gemstones, rubies, emeralds, sapphires. Chum knelt down and picked up just enough of the gems to fill his small sack. And then he carefully climbed back on the bird's back, and they were away again, up into the air, up over the sea, over the land, until at last they landed in Chum's courtyard. Now, Chum didn't know how to thank the bird, but he gave a shy smile and thanks. And he watched as the bird flew off again towards the sea. As soon as the bird was out of sight, Chum went to the well and drew a bucket of water and poured it over the roots of the tree. "This tree has brought me great fortune. Now I can buy some hens, maybe even a field." Well, Chum soon learned he could buy many, many hens and many, many fields. But he only wanted one wife. And he already knew who he wanted. A simple, hard-working girl, very much like himself. And in not too long, they were married and lived very happily in the little house underneath the starfruit tree. Now, you remember Chum's brother, Zoo. He was living in comfort in the farmhouse all this time, but he heard about his brother's good fortune. And he wanted more. He paid his brother a visit. "Brother, I'm so sorry I could not attend your wedding, but I'm here now to make amends. Now you are a married man, I think you really need a larger house. So you and your wife must move into the farmhouse and I will move here." Now Chum didn't want to go. He loved his small house. He loved the starfruit tree. But his brother kept asking and asking and asking. And so in the end, because he was the elder brother, Chum agreed. And he and his wife moved into the farmhouse, and Zoo moved into that small home. Zoo waited eagerly for the tree to fruit again and the bird to come. He didn't take care of the tree. He didn't water it. He didn't feed it. He let the insects attack it, and its branches went unpruned. But in time, the pink flowers came, and then the fruit, though they were not as sweet and juicy as they had been. When the fruit were on the branches, he watched and waited eagerly for the bird to come. The bird did not come for a long, long time. And then, one morning, there it was, sitting in a high branch, munching daintily on a starfruit. Zoo rushed out of the house. "Hey, you! That's my tree. If you want to eat the fruit, you'll have to pay for it." The bird looked down at Zoo. It looked deep into his eyes. It seemed to see right inside him. "I will eat no more of your fruit, and I will pay for what I have eaten. make a small sack, just the size. No, I want to go now. I already have the sack. And he dashed into the house and came out with a sack, not the size of one hand, or 2 or 3, but 5 handspans wide and 10 handspans long. The bird looked at Zoo long and hard. And then it flew down and landed at its feet. Zoo scrambled on the bird's back and held on tight. The bird rose in the air, higher and higher, over land and over sea. But Zoo, he had no eyes for the land below or the clouds so near. He was too busy thinking about the jewels and what he would do with them. And when they landed in that same small valley, Zoo leapt off the bird's back and began stuffing his huge sack with jewels. He filled it right to the top and tied it tightly. And then he stuffed his pockets full of jewels. Why, he even filled his hat with jewels. And then he clambered back onto the bird's back and urged it into the air. The bird rose in the air. The bird was strong, but the sack was heavy. The bird flew on, but it flew more slowly. Now, after a time, the clouds grew dark and the wind got up. The wind blew harder. And Zoo began to be nervous, and so he tipped the jewels out of his hat into the sea. The bird was strong, but the sack was heavy. The bird flew on, but it flew more slowly, and the sea grew nearer. Zoo emptied his pockets of the jewels, and they fell like sparkling rain into the sea below. The bird was strong, but the sack was heavy. The bird flew on, but it flew more slowly, and the sea grew nearer, and the waves grew higher. Suddenly, a huge wave hit the bird and tumbled Zoo into the waves. The bird stayed near, hovering close by. But Zoo would not let go of the sack, and so he sank beneath the waves, never again to see the light of the sun. As for Chum, well, he stayed in the farmhouse for a while. But he missed his old house. He missed the starfruit tree. And so he and his wife moved back and raised many, many children in the shade of the starfruit tree. Okay, Roger.
Very nice, very nice. Yeah, I just had to.
A long time since you've heard that one, right?
It is, yes, yes, yes. And it's funny, you just in the last part, the repetition and the sea came nearer and nearer. I was just remembering the song about the girl who's strapped to the, to the tracks and she in the sawmill. And she's been driven nearer and nearer and nearer. Sorry, just nothing to do with it.
See how Roger's imagination goes.
There we go. That's right. You see, we each make our own associations with a story, don't we?
Yes. One of the things about telling a story is not to move straight on into really, hard-boiled sort of things. Let the children just absorb the story. And a good way to move into other activities is to do a visualization. Now, you wouldn't want this to be too long, so I'm going to do a very short one with you. You might even want to do a shorter one with children. But I would like you all, I can't see you apart from Roger, so Roger, you're going to be the example. I want you to close your eyes. And I just want you to relax, and I want to take you back into that story. And I want you to imagine that you are Chum, standing inside the doorway of his little house, looking out at that starfruit tree. And I want you to look and see that starfruit tree where it is in the courtyard. And see what else there is in the courtyard. Is it paved or is it dirt? Are there other plants? Can you see over? Is there a wall, a fence? Can you see over? What do you see in the distance? As you're standing there, what do you smell? Is this something from outside or something that's coming from inside the house? And what can you hear as you're standing there, from outside, from behind you, inside? Now I want you to turn around and look inside Cham's little house. Look and notice what furniture he has. Look down at the floor. What's it made of? Look up into the roof. What do you see? I want you to choose one thing in that room. Could be a table, it could be anything. And just walk towards it and touch it. And how does it feel when you touch it? Is it rough? Is it smooth? Is it warm? Is it cold? And now I want you to walk outside again and take maybe 5, 6 steps outside the house and turn around and look at the front of the house. What does it look like? What's it made of? Now take one last look around, and when you're ready, open your eyes. Okay, Roger. So what did you see?
Wow, yeah, so much. For me, I see that as I stand in the doorway, looking out, and it's really like a courtyard. There's a wall that runs around it. I mean, low in the sense probably just above my head height, I guess. And there's an archway, a gateway at the facing me. Besides the tree, I have a small pond where I have fish. And I've started on there's a vegetable kind of garden also to one side. And I hear the sounds of the village beyond the wall. There's some cattle. I myself, I've got a bird in a cage. Sorry, starfruit bird, but I do have a singing bird I keep in a cage. The house, I'm afraid, is rather empty because I haven't got the woman of my dreams yet. Yeah. So I think that really does need a woman's touch. So it's pretty Spartan, I have to say. It's a nice little house, and originally I thought it would be dark, but actually when I turned around, I saw that there were 2 lovely windows, and the light was kind of streaming in. My table is very plain, but it's a well-made table, and I'm looking forward to sitting down with somebody and eating there regularly together.
Oh, so sweet. Hermione, welcome. Thanks.
Hi.
How was your experience of that?
I honestly can feel the village, the sense of the village. I felt that it was calming because I can recall how you mentioned it in the story, how you walked us through the whole setting. And I felt that as I walk through with you, as I close my eyes and walk through with you, as you describe it, I felt that it was a place that I want to be, away from the hustle and bustle of life right now. It will be nice. Escapism. Yeah. What a nice change. Yeah, you know, just to be somebody else for a change these few weeks and weeks to come.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the description, the richness of the description that you gave that really painted that picture for me.
About the richness of the description, was that in the story?
From the story.
I don't think I talked very much about the setting, did I?
You didn't, but I suppose I have to admit I listened to you tell this story a few times before this.
Oh, okay.
But then again, so basically I was also recalling from the past where I've heard you've done elaborate.
Perhaps.
Yes, that's right. Very elaborate description.
But the interesting thing is, there's not that much description in the story. There's a star fruit tree, there's a well. I don't describe the well. I don't really describe the star fruit tree apart from the pink flowers and the fruit. And if those of you who know what a star fruit tree will know what it looks like. I'm lucky there's a few of them around my estate, so I know exactly what it looks like. But if not, you would have made something up. But what always fascinates me is you just give people a word here, a word there, and they can create so much out of it in their imaginations. So no, I wouldn't do this. I made it a bit longer for you, but for children, at first you've got to keep it, you know, a little bit short, and gradually go longer. But it's amazing what, if you really spend time imagining, things will pop up, and sometimes things that you can actually use in the story very nicely. So I would use this, I would recommend using this as, you know, little and often for kids. Okay.
And I could see also that perhaps some children might want to respond to that with a picture.
Yes.
They'd actually like to draw the garden or the house.
That's a good second thing to do after that. So I've just got these helping questions for visualization, which you will have when you get the PowerPoint. But it's really about making it very sensory. After the visualization, another really good thing to do is to get the kids to do a story map, because this is starting the work on the setting. And to understand the setting of a story, you really have to know the whole setting. So there's various, I mean, it can be a very rough map. The one on the right is a fairly rough one, or it can be my wonderful artwork on the left, which is my best drawing, I'll have you know. This is a story, and actually this is very useful for me, because this is a story that I worked on. It's called The Ugly Queen. It's a Scottish traveller story, Duncan Williamson's, I found one of Duncan Williamson's book. And I look at that, and the story comes back to me immediately, because I know that the queen lives in this castle. Her husband's gone off to war and been killed. She's been left a widow. She's got a young child, but the giant who lives in this purple castle on this island has stolen her child. And she has to go and she looks for help, and the help comes from Jack, who lives in that little cottage on the left-hand side there.
And I see there's a ship, and look, is that a chicken up in the top?
Swan, who is the helper.
Swan, I'm sorry.
Yes, there's a swan, and then further on there's a little red rowing boat.
Yes.
Yeah, so my swan is not very good. But as you are doing that, you really get a sense of where things are happening. Now, the one on the right, I have to give credit to, I think it's Chris Bostock and Malcolm Green, who are British storytellers who came to Singapore a few years ago, and I attended a workshop. And this was one of the things we did in the workshop. They told a story, and then first of all, they asked us what scene in the story really struck you? Just sketch it out. And so you see on the left-hand side, that little square there is where I sketched out that scene that really I made an impact on me. And then they asked us to draw a map, a rough map of the story. But this was the thing I thought was quite magic, to put in the emotions that the different characters felt in the places where they felt them. So drawing a map is not just about the setting. It can also be about the emotion of the characters. You get into character work. You can also write descriptive words about the different settings, you know, different places in the setting on the map. So I think this is something that is very simple to do, but has quite a deep impact when you do it. And also it gives you an opportunity for the children to share their maps with each other, to discuss. So it's more speaking can go on, more ideas can be swapped. Yeah. So another idea. This is really
just to pick up,
internalizing the story. That's what we're doing. We're internalizing the story now.
Going back to as someone earlier had mentioned about, I think it was Jemini, working in terms with mother tongue, how I shared this story of the legend of Bukit Merah or Red Hill. Bukit Merah is Bahasa for Red Hill. And so when I got the children to do their map of the story, I also gave them the Malay words for the sea, the forest, the village, the king, this kind of thing. And so they actually labeled their map with Bahasa as well as English. And so that some of them were then were happy to use the Malay as they were then sharing the story.
Nice.
Yeah. So I really like this idea of adding the emotions or whatever particular language aspect. You know, look at the different ways. Where is she running? Where would she skip? Where would she hop or slither or whatever the different movements are in the story?
Yeah. So then we get to storyboards. So a storyboard, you have to think like a film director. And you just break the story down into scenes and you draw the most important image of each scene. Now, this is one of the stories that I tell. It's called Coyote and the Bird. And this is a storyboard done by a 7-year-old boy.
Okay. Yeah, I hadn't recognized it was that story, but now you say, okay.
Now I say it, you can see it, right?
Totally, yeah.
But the thing about storyboards, it's not about art. And I always tell, you know, whether they're adults or students, do stick figures. The thing is with kids, they'll really tend to get into it if they're into drawing. But it's not about the drawing. It's about the thinking process that you have to go through in order to condense that scene down into one, you know, small image. You have to see what is the most important image in that scene. And that's a higher order thinking skill. So doing storyboarding is a really good thing to do. It helps you with the sequence of the story, but it's also starting to get the kids away from the words and into visuals. You want them to think visually, because if they think visually, then that will come back into their writing and back into their telling. They're not just, you know, copying the words. You want them to really see the story. And this is a storyboard. Normally, I would give 15 minutes for a storyboard, whether adults or children. Sometimes they can take 20 minutes. So I've also had this thing called speedy storyboarding, which is a fun game that I've used with kindergarten kids upwards. Whereas basically you retell the story again in little snatches. So you do a little bit and then you clap. And at that point, they have to draw. They have 15 seconds to draw that scene. And then you again and you carry on. They have to put down their pencils. And you go through the story that way with them. So that if you're short of time, that's a very effective way. And the kids absolutely love it because it's a game.
Yeah.
And it stops them obsessing about, can I draw that? I always tell them, you know, if you don't know how to draw it, draw a circle or a triangle or a square. As long as you know what it is, it doesn't matter. Because, you know, it also helps that my drawing's rubbish too.
But again, you see, I mean, you said right at the start, this is, such a holistic way, because, if you go with that circle, square, and triangle, then when you finish the story, then as with all maps, you would produce a key, right? So that you could remember tomorrow when you look at that, oh yes, the triangle is the king and the circle is the frog, so, yeah.
Yeah, that's a nice idea. Okay, so because we're going to go on to one of my favorite activities, which is hot seating. Now, those of you who've had some drama training will be familiar with this, but if you haven't, hot seating is a very simple activity that you can do, in which you as the teacher, in the beginning it has to be you, but later on you can get the students to take this on, but you need to model. You take on take on the role of one of the characters in the story, and the students would ask you questions as if you were that character. So this gives the students the chance to imagine that this character has walked into their classroom and now they get to find out more about that character, find out more about the story. You don't have to act. It's not about acting, though if you want to, if that's your thing, you can get into role a little bit, but it's not necessary at all. Now, depending on how good your students are at formulating questions, if they are, then you can go straight into it. If not, you might want to discuss first. Now, if you got to meet, say, in this case, let's do Chum, the younger brother, the goody two-shoes younger brother in this story. If you got to meet Chum, what might you want to ask him? And so you as the teacher could then, get some ideas, or you will get the children into pairs and say, each come up, each pair comes up with a question. So that you kind of set that, because what you don't want to do is sit there and then they don't know what to ask you. Quite frankly, it's usually adults that have that problem, not the kids. Right, Roger?
Yes. So are we asking questions, or you're going to be?
Imagine I'm sitting in a red seat, okay?
Yes.
Hot seat. But can you promote a few more people? Let's get Jemini back.
She's in there, and Lavanya and Mindy, who's out showing
Hi.
the guided night tour of Singapore. How about?
So, okay, I have sat down in the red chair, and now I'm no longer SHEILA WEE. I am Chum. Okay, so hi everyone.
Hi.
Hello, Cham.
Some questions.
Hi, Chang.
After you, Lavanya.
So who's got?
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, Nupur. Yes. So
Hi.
we'll cue you to ask a question. So, Lavanya, would you like to ask Cham a question?
Yes. Cham, can you tell me what do you like the best about your house?
You know what? It's when I lie on my sleeping mat, because it's kind of at the back of the house, but it faces the door. And in the mornings, I open the door and I lie there and I see the starfruit tree. And I love that early morning light. When the sun has just come up and the light is all soft and nice and the breeze is blowing and the trees. I just lie there, not very long because I know I've got to get up. I have to get up and work. But just maybe for 5 minutes before I get up, I just lie there and I smell the breeze and I look at my starfruit tree and the blue sky beyond. And
very nice, Cham. Thank you. Okay, but we're not sponsored by the Vietnam Tourist Association. Jemini, have you got a question? What would you like to ask?
Yes, definitely. I know you're such a darling, but seriously, I'm sure there's a bit of jealousy inside your heart, Zhu being your bigger brother, having a big house, and you small house. I mean, all the inheritance that you got. Please tell me.
Yeah.
Don't you have a bit of that in your heart?
Yeah, actually, I was a little bit resentful at first. But the thing was, I knew it was going to happen.
Really?
Yeah, I knew this is
Why?
the way things are. This is the way things are. The elder brother gets everything. The younger brother is lucky. I'm actually supposed to go off and work for myself. But I love, this farm so much. I really didn't want to leave. So I knew since young, yeah, I was a bit resentful, but no, I'm more,
Okay.
he's more annoying, He's always an annoying brother, the ones that, that is not bad temper. His temper is the thing that annoys me more than anything.
Oh dear. Nupur, yes. Would you like to ask Cham a question?
So why didn't you, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, we can.
So why didn't you show your resentment when your brother got everything and you were just given what you have got, ultimately a small house?
But actually, I like the house. And if you have a big house, there's so much to clean, and there's so much responsibility as well. If you are in charge of running the whole farm, it's a big farm, We were wealthy. My parents are quite wealthy. So actually, my house is quite nice. It's small, but and it's much easier to look after. And it's in the better part because it gets, the farmhouse is in a dip, so it gets very hot there. So it's just, let him have, I'm quite happy.
Thank you. We're good to hear that. Do you think, have you got a question? Maybe you'd like to trade houses. It looks like you need to find a place to stay.
Okay, am I? Hello?
Yeah, you're fine.
Yes,
What would you
you're
like to
fine.
ask, Cham?
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. My question is, what did that bird that you saw look like? Could you describe in detail?
Wow, it was enormous. And it had sort of it wasn't kind of golden, but it was that browny gold feathers. And particularly on the head, it was more darker brown. And on the tops of the wings, it was a darker brown with a kind of goldy fleck in it. And underneath, it was it was really kind of white, and it had a white breast. Yeah, and it actually had a great kind of hooked beak. So it kind of looked kind of scary. It was huge.
Yeah. Well, that sounds very good, and we could go on, and I'd love to know about this young lady that you found, but I think just because of time, we'd better leave the Vietnam dating service till another day. So can we move along, Sheila?
Yes, we can move along. Can we say goodbye to our lovely panelists? Thank you so much.
Bye.
Okay, so that's hot seating. It's very simple, and you can do this as preschoolers. 6-year-olds, 5-year-olds, they can handle this, but you have to model. Now the interesting thing comes later on. Once the children are used to this, and this is something you can do very often, then you get the children to take on the characters, and that's where it gets really interesting because the kids have completely different ideas from us adults, and yeah, so that I urge you to try this one. It's very simple. It's very portable. You can just do it at any time. It's a very practical activity. Sorry, Roger, you're going to say something?
I was just going to chip in. For those if you haven't tried that, the idea of teller in role or teacher in role in this case, I would totally agree with what you said earlier, Sheila, that this is not about acting. It's really about just taking on the mindset, the attitude of this particular character. So that is, and once you've got that, if you keep that in your head, then that will affect the kind of responses that you are giving. So just think, if it's a warm, kind, generous person, then respond warm, kindly, and generously. If the person is, if you were playing the older brother, you would be much more suspicious and unwilling to answer things. And why are you asking me that? And don't be so rude. It would just because you would be much more perhaps defensive or even aggressive in your responses.
Yes.
So you don't have to, I'm sorry, I naturally went into putting on a voice and doing stuff, but it's more about having an attitude, isn't it? And that way you'll get through it.
And I think don't worry about it. about the ideas. I mean, I had no idea what I was going to answer. You just say the first thing that comes into your head.
Mm.
And usually it's the right thing. And if you're so, I don't know, let me think about that one. Give yourself a bit of time if you don't. But generally, just think whatever pops into your head. You will get, the more you do it, the easier it becomes. But you need to model it for the kids first, so that they will know exactly how to do it. So moving on, this is another nice one. This is very simple, the role on the wall. You imagine you have a cutout, a figure, a drawn figure. You could draw around one of the kids, and that is the character. So this one is Cham, and this is a collaborative class thing where you would write down. I've only put a few in, but you could actually fill that up with things about that character. So things like what the character likes, what he dislikes. Now, what is Cham's favorite food? Yeah. Really, maybe it's chicken pho. I don't know. But you can things about their family, how they feel about themselves, about different things, how they feel about different characters in the story, and what other people think about that character. So you try and keep it within the story, although there'll be some things that move out of the story, like the character's likes and dislikes. That's not in the story, but maybe you will find some things in there that you can bring into the story. So this can go up on the wall, and it can really help to have that up there for students, to give them ideas when you are doing either work on character or you're actually writing the story. And you can write all sorts of words down there to help.
I imagine that if you do this with kids early on, that their future language or literature teachers will love you and thank you, because when kids come to read a book later on, they'll remember the silly things that they did with Miss Wee, and putting up, rolls on the wall and pictures and all this kind of stuff, and will instinctively refer back to this and start applying this, because this would also, in a different way, you could use this with any book that you read as well, couldn't you?
Yeah. Exactly. This is character statements is an activity which is a very good one to lead into dialogue, and writing dialogue is important in a story. It's not all in dialogue, but if you can put some dialogue in there, it kind of juices the story up. So you find a place in the story that is pivotal, a dramatic point in the story. Okay? So in this story, Cham's elder brother Zhu, it's actually written Do. I have to tell you, I rang up the Vietnamese embassy to find out suitable names. That actually means helpful or something like that, and Zhu means something not so good, but the Du is pronounced Zhu. So Cham's elder brother Zhu has just heard about Cham's good fortune. He's heard all about the tree, the bird, and the jewels. Now you ask the children, my children here, Jumani, Mindy, Nupur, and Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks for joining us here. It was accidental. I just pressed the wrong button. But
it was a bit of a surprise.
Well, there you are. Okay. Where are you? Just to
I'm in the south of Spain.
Oh, wow, there we go. Good.
Imagine that you are all Zoop, the elder brother, nasty elder brother.
Okay.
Just heard that Cham has got all these riches, and he's just heard the whole story, the gossip.
Yeah.
What might he be thinking in just one statement? Just give me one statement each. Just your thoughts. Yes.
Thanks, Nupur. Yep.
Hard work pays off.
Oh, hard work pays off. Wow, you've got an optimistic view of character. That's interesting. Okay, Jemini, what would Zhu be thinking, the bad brother? What would he be thinking when he heard about his younger brother's good fortune?
He must have stolen it from someone.
Okay.
Evil, right?
Rebecca?
He's always so lucky.
Yeah.
Mindy?
The Singaporean may be like, sure not.
I like that.
But it's yeah, I think I'll feel definitely jealous and wanting to envious. Yeah. So
So what you could do, you could do this with the class. You could either ask them to write down their thoughts straight away,
Yeah.
or you could go around the class tapping them on the shoulder, and they speak the thoughts, and then they write down. So basically this is what you do. You imagine a character's thoughts at a dramatic point in the story. And I would also discuss, if you think this is going to be difficult, you discuss with the class, to give, if the weaker students, might need some ideas, or you pair them off with one stronger and one weaker student. So they write it out. And then,
Sheila?
yes?
Oh, sorry, no. Oh, no, carry on, please. Yeah, it's okay.
Oh, and then you move, that kind of prepares them for dialogue. Because in order to write the dialogue, you need to have the thought process behind that. So now we're going to do a little role play.
Can I, just before you move on there, Sheila, can I just, again, one of the ways that if you wanted to get the children up and be active, as Sheila says, you have them in a pair, and I will often ask them to create like a still image. So it might be the two brothers, for example, and then you could imagine that you could ask them for what this person would be thinking, would be a thought bubble. Okay.
Such a BC moment.
So it could be a thought bubble, or now that, as Sheila wants to do, which is to go into a dialogue. And so what would be the speech bubble? So back to you, Sheila.
Yeah. Okay. So can I have two volunteers? So Nupur, maybe be Cham.
Okay.
Rebecca, you be Zoo. So Nupur, you're the good brother. Rebecca, you're the bad brother. Zoo has just arrived in Cham's house and wants to persuade him to move out. Okay, go.
Cham, how are you today?
Hey, nice to meet you, brother. Doing good. How about you?
Yeah, good. But poor you. This house is just too small for you, don't you think?
No, dear. I like it because there's less work to do in the house if it's this size.
But you'd be so much more comfortable in my house, in the big house. Don't you think?
But what makes you think that this house is not comfortable for me? I'm pretty happy here.
Well, as your kind, as the older brother, as your kind brother, your older brother, I want to take care of you. And really, I think you should go and stay in the big house. This is a present from me to you. And I'll be quite offended if you refuse my present.
You mean, Zoo, that you're inviting me to come and stay with you in your house?
Oh, no, I'm happy just to take the little kind of, small, cramped house. I don't mind. I'll sacrifice myself for you.
Oh, where were you all this while?
Wonderful.
So much. Thank you so much. So you see, you can do this and pick the strongest pairs. So first of all, you start with the character statements. And then you go into the role-playing, the dialogue. And while you get the kids to do it in pairs in the class, and while they're doing it, you are wandering around, seeing who has got the best ideas, who's coming up with, interesting dialogue. And then afterwards, you showcase those kids. That really helps those kids who are struggling a little bit. You're scaffolding it for the dialogue for those kids. And you can use these examples to, teach punctuation and grammar. You can write these down and then perhaps use them to teach different things in writing. So you can do this as a standalone activity. You might not actually use it in the in the written activity, or you can then, they can lift this dialogue and put it in their story. You could create a whole, you could even create a play or something from it. You know, there's all sorts of things. But I think it's a fun activity, and it gets kids really. If you start with a character statement, they're kind of thinking the motivation, and I think people don't think, children sometimes when they write stories don't think about the motivation of the characters, and that's very important.
And I imagine if you did this as a class activity, I mean, if you had them in pairs, you would see that you could get different pairs to share the stories, and then you would have very different approaches to the way that Sue did this, which would again, I'm sure, be fascinating and give you lots of opportunity for discussion. And maybe again, as you said at the start, this is about collaboration. And so people would start taking things from the different zoos, the way that they had spoken, and of course the different responses they'd heard from Cham.
Yeah.
Which is great.
So these are just some of the activities that you can do, the more oral activities. As I said, I've got more in the handout, because this is only, you know, we've only got a few 20 minutes left. Once you feel that the kids have really got a good hold on the story, then you move into the written retelling activities. So they could rewrite the whole story in their own words, or they could rewrite part of the story. Sometimes you don't have to write the whole story. You could, you know, or you could divide the story up into you know, different
groups in the class.
You know, that's a fantastic way of creating a publication. Is you just chunk the story up into scenes, and you number the kids off. Say there's 12 scenes, so you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, and number 1 does this scene. All the number 1s do this scene. All the number 2s do this scene, and they each write that scene out. They each illustrate that scene, and then you put those together. They've got a book. Or a set of kamishibai cards, a set of storytelling cards where they show the illustration and they can read or retell their part of the story. Then, very important, they don't just, once they've gone from the telling and the oral activities to the writing, they go back to the oral activities again. They need to read aloud each other's writing in pairs, so that the kids get immediate feedback. For comprehension. Sometimes kids, when they're writing, they know what they're wanting to put across, but it doesn't quite come out in the writing, and they're not even aware that they haven't communicated it clearly. But the moment they have to read it aloud and somebody else goes, huh? they realize, and then they can go back and revise.
And again, because as you said, it is so holistic, the children are getting practice at their reading aloud. They're reading aloud something that they are familiar with, in that they know the story. They may not be familiar with the exact text, which is going to help them so that they can read more effectively. Kids who are writing this out know that someone's actually going to have to read it, and so they will take more care over their writing. You know, everything is just kind of building and reinforcing.
So really, that's it. You know, there's various ways you can revise, you can publish. There's all sorts of things you can do. But for those kids who really want to run with it, they can start to innovate. But that has to come once they're familiar with this process, once they're very familiar with the story. And they've rewritten, maybe you can rewrite it first, and then they could do an innovation after a first writing of the story. They could do the story again, but innovate. So by innovation, it's you know, simple things like substituting characters. So it doesn't have to, that story that I told about Cham and Zoo, the starfruit tree, doesn't have to be set in Vietnam. It could be transposed. It could be different characters in different settings. There's a lot of stories where you can change up the characters. They could be sisters instead of brothers. It could be in a different country. It might not be on a farm. It might be something else. It might be the business empire. It might not be a star fruit tree. It might be something else. It might be his fried chicken stall.
Yeah.
You know,
it doesn't always have to be the older brother who's the bad guy.
Yes.
It might be the younger brother who's the bad guy.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things that could be simply innovated. Do a new opening or closing to the story. So maybe you can change the ending of the story or change the beginning of the story. Work on description of something in the story. You can add more dialogue. You can create new dialogue or a new episode to the story. But perhaps in this story you could talk about how he wooed his wife. Maybe there's a story there.
And the fact that Zhu there's no mention of his wife in the story, that might be another thing that makes him very jealous too.
Yes. There's all sorts of possibilities. Now, for older students, you could also ask them to write the story from a different viewpoint. So write the story from the viewpoint of the starfruit tree or the bird. Yeah? Or of their mother. Now it says the father died. It didn't say the mother died. So the mother could have been watching all this while worrying about, so. Or you could go into the different genres. So write the story as a diary entry, a letter, or a newspaper report, and you get into the more upper primary levels, which is what you'd be wanting to do anyway. But because they're so familiar with it and they've worked on it, it becomes so much easier for them to do this story in a different genre. Yeah? Very
good. I'm just got an eye on the time here, Sheila. Do you want to see if you can just wrap this and keep about 10 minutes for questions?
So I call this a roadmap, the telling to writing roadmap. You start with the teacher telling a story. You do oral and written exploration activities, oral retelling activities, so they get to tell the story in their own words. And then they go into the written retelling activities, and lastly, the written innovation activities. But the important thing to remember is to keep them moving back and forth between the oral and the written, because that it really enriches both. It strengthens both areas. So this process, it really allows students to formulate ideas on the topic, for them to get immediate feedback on those ideas from their listeners. And the listeners get ideas that they then can incorporate into their own writing. And as I say, it's also very holistic, and that they get practice in oral presentation skills and in listening skills. So this is why I love this approach. And that's kind of it. It's come to...
Well, I thank you. And the reason, Nupur, I've brought you back on, let me unmute you, is because you had a question. So I thought, why don't you ask that in person about do they make up a common story or something? Would you like to ask that question?
Yeah, so some time back I had posted a question that the story that you share, with the students depends on their age, right?
Yes,
you wouldn't be sharing a gunny wolf or going on a bear hunt if you are initiating writing for teens, for example.
No, you would use a more sophisticated story.
Yeah, a more complicated structure for them to explore.
Yeah, slightly more complicated structure. I mean, because hopefully by that time they would be able to handle it. But it's really, I think you have to look at your class.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it's done in their mother tongue or whether it's done in another language they're not so familiar with. And I don't think there's anything wrong with going back to simple, if that works for the students and it works for the teacher.
Okay. And I had one more question. Okay.
Yes, go on. Do ask I was seeing Diti had a question, but I'm not sure if she's still with us. So go on, ask your question.
Yeah, Yeah, I forgot. I had posted it. Now I can't recall it.
You can find it. Where are we?
Yeah. So I think Lavanya too has a question. So
Yeah, I'll get to Lavanya. Why don't you were asking about a common story. This is, you mean the whole entire class comes up with a common story first? That was your question.
Yeah. That was my question. So you said that ultimately in the process, after when we finish that role play and the dialogue, so is it like when you've been talking about collaborative work? So is it, so doesn't final product is one story from the entire class?
Really depends. You could do, I mean, for younger children, if it was preschool level, you would probably want to do a collaborative story for the whole class.
Okay.
And maybe get those children who are able maybe to write on their own. But generally, in the primary levels, you would then want the children to be working on their own version of the story, because they're getting the practice at writing. So for very young children, yes, you might do a collaborative story of the whole class. You might break the story down into scenes, so each child writes about one scene of the story.
But then in that case, if everybody is working on a different scene, then there can be a conflict when the entire story is put together.
Yeah, so then you will have to have some, a little bridging or whatever. But generally, if the scenes are distinct, and you say you go from here to here, and remember they're not. It's not like if they were making their own story. It is a known story, so it's not likely to be so much. I mean, I've done this with preschoolers where we've made books, and in this childcare group, the teachers have used this extensively, and it's worked very, very well.
All right.
Great.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you, Nupur. Lavanya, yes.
Yes.
Going back to your question you asked a long time ago.
Yeah. So one thing I asked earlier was sometimes children don't want to write. So they are, most of the time they like to listen, they like to do their drawings, they like to do their storyboards. But when it comes to writing, they all go into a shell. They say that, ma'am, next class. We'll do it next class. So but eventually we would want them to write because that's what we promised. And I was just asking in the question that, is there a possibility of using any fun activities that could be added to help them or make them write?
Well, I mean, that's interesting.
But you don't think the dialogue and the role play and all these things are fun activities?
No, they're all okay doing that. My thing is they're okay doing that. But when it comes to writing, they don't want to put it in paper.
Well, maybe cut it down into smaller chunks then. I would say, because and maybe why is it they don't want to do it? That's the thing. If they feel, oh, I've got these ideas, I know I can do it, and I can be creative. Generally, children will want to, but maybe they've been told that their writing is not very good, and that is really why you've got to look at what you as teachers are saying, what parents are saying, the product, and that's also I don't believe in giving too shiny a product too often.
That's right.
Because parents particularly get addicted to that shiny product, and when the child doesn't give that, they don't see the value. Instead, I think you talk to the parents about what they've learned in this exercise, and learning points that need to come across. Not that, oh, look at this, maybe chunking it down, make it in smaller, having an activity and then a small bit of writing, not expecting them to write for so long, maybe challenging them. So okay, how many words, we're going to do 5 minutes writing, and then we're going to count up how many words. And maybe if you hit something, they get some sort of
all right.
want to reward them, but at least a challenge or something like that.
Or to make it a very specific target. So, you know, Cham is going to say something to Zoo, and Zoo's going to reply. Or Zoo, the other, will say something to, you know, one reason why he wants him to move and one reason why he's not going to. So, again, it's very specific and limited, if you like, so that just to get them started.
I think to make it seem doable for them, and not, you know, because otherwise it can be overwhelming. That's why I think writing a whole story can sometimes seem overwhelming to
That's right.
So,
thank you, Sheila. Thank you.
Sure. So perhaps this fits this. We have an anonymous attendee who writes, my students have very limited vocabulary as English is their second language. How do we provide support?
Yeah. One thing I would say, use, as I said earlier, use very, very simple stories that have repetitive patterns in them. And tell that story a lot. You tell that story a lot, and maybe you write it, maybe you can have it written out for them as well. So they hear it, and also they read it. There's a very good book that actually, I'll show it up here. It's called, it's coming out backwards, isn't it? It's called Read and Retell. And I used this, about 25 years or so ago, when I was running an English language center. And it's by Hazel Brown and Brian Campbell, and they're Australian academics. And basically the premise of this book is you give children, you have a very short story or a very short passage. You give the children some experience, so you discuss this beforehand, what it's about the subject. Then they read the passage, maybe I think it's a couple of times, and then they rewrite the passage. And it's amazing. I use that with kids. And what happens when you do that consistently is the language in the written text comes out in their writing. But you have to give them enough experience of discussing it and maybe talking about it and really understanding it, and then just reading it a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, and it will come out. So maybe something like that, using very, very simple stories, and until they're so familiar with to the children orally, and then writing them out so that they read them, so they can read them, and then maybe doing little adaptations. So just changing the characters' names. So they write it out again, but say it was a bear hunt, okay? We're going on a bear hunt. So maybe you just change it, we're going on a lion hunt, you know? So you change the character, you change small things about the setting, which you can do as a class, and then they start to write it out. Or
perhaps, Sheila, we could just, I'm sorry because of the time here, perhaps this is something that we could also think about for a future webinar, and that is looking at storytelling in terms of language education, or where you're using a second language to tell the story, and how can you support that? Because I think that's possibly what we're kind of straying into here.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That's a fantastic idea, Roger.
Oh, thank you very much. So I think really, because we're really coming up to the 2 hours on the session, and I'm going to say we should stop here. So thank you very much, Sheila, for this, taking us through. You've promised us several goodies, so could you just recap what it is that you're going to be sending out?
You will get the link to this webinar. Yeah, I will also PDF the PowerPoints, so that you'll get a PDF of the PowerPoints. And I've got, I think it's a 10-page handout with lots more activities, which, as I said, you are free to use in any way you want, but just if you're using it commercially in any way that you give attribution. I think that's fair enough, but please adapt, use it, and have a go. That's the main thing. Dare to fail.
Well, I'm sure, Sheila, with this very clear and methodical way that you've taken us through this, hopefully you have reduced people's fear of failure and given them a roadmap, as you say, through this process. And I think that there are plenty of different activities that people can try as they go through the exploring stage, responding to the story, in that process then of moving on to retelling, and of course then finally writing down the story. So with that, let us bring this to a close, and I thank you all. We would appreciate your feedback, because this is the first time that we have done this kind of structure. It's been very strange not having all the kind of faces up there, and do let us know. And I hope that the people I brought in and then summarily dismissed, and I do apologize if you suddenly felt like you were in and then you were out. If you have any suggestions how we might handle that differently or better in the future, do let us know. We really do want to have more a dialogue going on and how we can better suit this to you. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again. Do keep spreading a word. I think this has been an excellent session and really practical and helpful. And we'd love to hear, I'm sure Sheila would love to hear, how you've actually used this material, and what stories you told, and how your kids responded. And if you had any pictures of what they did or a story that they wrote, that would be fantastic. We would love to get that onto the Feast website. So thank you very much indeed, and bye-bye. And thank you very much, Sheila.